I hear the winter winds picking up outside our office, so I don't know what you're experiencing where you are, but we have about 21 in wind with some snow to the north of us.
Are you talking to me?
I was just talking to everyone in general, so thanks for
Oh,
listening.
yeah, Nebraska is not a fun place to be in right now. We are with wind chill, we are -10 today.
Oh my goodness. And where is that?
Nebraska, Kearney, Nebraska.
Okay. In Kearney. Yes. Yes. You're not too far from us then.
Where do you guys live?
We office in Holdridge.
Oh, awesome.
Uh, so yeah, we have people continuing to join us. Excuse me. So Sherry, if you want to go ahead and put up the slides, that would be great. Thank you. We'll give everybody just a couple more minutes and then we will begin. So thank you to all of you who've already joined us and are eagerly awaiting our presentation today. I mentioned this earlier, but if you do have difficulties watching, we are streaming this on our YouTube channel. So pop over there if you encounter difficulties with your Zoom account. I hope that everybody had a great holiday season. Due to a variety of issues, we are still waiting to celebrate Christmas. I think we're going to have to call it a Valentine's, St. Patrick's Day extravaganza or something by the time we get together, but it'll be good to be together. Also, a reminder as we get ready to begin, please make sure that you are on mute. If you're not familiar with Zoom, that feature is in the bottom left-hand screen. Just move your mouse over and hover around the microphone that pops up on your toolbar and just click that to mute yourself, if you would, please. Thank you. Dina is joining us from snowy Minden. So thanks, Dina. Appreciate that. I'm seeing good numbers still joining us. So we'll maybe give 30 more seconds. Erin says she's joining from North Platte, but no snow there. That sounds awesome. Actually, the sun has just come out here. So crazy winter weather. Well, Sherry, if you're ready.
I am ready.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just want to welcome everybody. We will begin our January 2024 HomeNE webinar. That just sounds almost unbelievable that it is already a new year, and we have wonderful speakers lined up for this year. So I am excited to get the ball rolling on not only today's webinar presentation, but also this new year of HomeNE. Sherry was sharing with me earlier that we have now touched in some manner 200 communities in the state of Nebraska. People have joined a HomeNE webinar or maybe a gathering from 200 distinct communities throughout Nebraska. So that's exciting. We've also had participants from 9 different states, and don't ask me to name them all off the top of my head, but we are excited that we continue to build this network, not only through Nebraska, but throughout and beyond our borders. So thank you for making HomeNE that toolbox item that you seek and look forward to each and every month. So welcome. As I mentioned, thank you for joining us. South Central Nebraska Economic Development District is the lead agent for HomeNE. HomeNE is designed for people from all across Nebraska, and as I just shared, beyond our borders. It is a network geared towards housing challenges in rural communities, providing face-to-face as well as online opportunities to foster interaction, engagement, and skill building for local leaders and people who are passionate about successfully addressing their local housing challenges. So, as the screen says, today we are being joined for our January HomeNE. Actually, the screen doesn't say his name, but this is Jake Hoppy. He is with Hoppy Development in Lincoln. And Jake, welcome. We are so excited to have you here today, and thanks for being our presenter. I believe Jake is also being joined by a coworker, Evan Clark. And so before you begin your presentation, Jake, would you mind just taking a moment to introduce yourself and maybe share a little bit about Evan as well before you launch into your presentation? That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks a lot for the invitation, and excited to have a few minutes with everyone to talk about some of the work that we've done. I'm Jake Hoppy with Hoppy Development, Managing Principal, joined with Evan Clark, one of our development associates who really focuses a lot on our rural community engagement. Um, I joined Hoppy Development in 2019, really building on the work of Fred Hoppy, who's my dad, who had got into affordable housing about 25 years ago, and we've really built a practice around understanding the different layers and different financing tools and opportunities and how to combine them to try and work with communities and nonprofits to meet their housing needs. And we'll be talking today, and I'll go a little bit more into just sort of some of our work as a firm, but then talk about a few observations in the rural housing market. We wanted to jump into a case study specific around some of our work repurposing nursing homes and how we've turned that into a bit of a platform. And then, ending with some observations about, what as a community it takes to kind of prepare, lay the groundwork to partner with a developer on projects like this. And then, really want to open up for questions and some of the community observations to make this more of a dialogue. It's a little hard in a Zoom context, but if you want to write them in via chat or wait, and we can open it up and unmute folks, we can turn it into a conversation. Evan, anything else that I missed in the brief introduction?
No, you got it there. You'll cover it again here in a second too, right?
Yeah, I probably will. So just going into us as an organization. So we're based in Lincoln, Nebraska, but we really serve throughout the state. So if you want to jump to the next slide, Sherry. We develop between 400 and 500 units of affordable housing a year. Usually that's 3 to 5 projects, depending on the year. We have a construction company that we use strategically. Oftentimes, or most of the time, we're building the units ourselves, and we have a construction capacity in Lincoln, Omaha, and central Nebraska. And it's one of the tools that we are able to use to help keep some of the housing affordable, or help think about what affordability means in certain contexts. And then we have a management company. So we usually are participating in our projects for a really long time. They're usually following some version of a compliance regime, whether it's what we call capital A affordable housing, which probably looks like the tax credit program, or lowercase a affordable housing, which might look more like rural workforce housing. In either case, there's usually some commitments we've made, and so we stick with the projects. We really focus on trying to innovate within the housing programs and thinking about how to combine the programs together to meet, a variety of community housing needs. We are especially excited about opportunities to both combine affordable and market rate together, so that we're really creating mixed income opportunities in the communities where we're serving. Uh, and yeah, so that's a bit of background on us. And we'll just go right into a few observations around some of the challenges of rural housing and really why we're so focused on innovation. Uh, Go ahead and jump to the next slide. Yeah. So what we see in a healthy housing market generally is a real variety in type of housing, scale of housing, and cost. And even if we get out of the lens of just, true affordable housing or capital A affordable housing, there's also this concept of affordable as appropriate for the needs of the housing consumer at that moment. And so at the top here, you have kind of an ideal progression where you go from, maybe earlier pre-family, you're renting units, and there's housing available for rent. As you go and maybe form a family, you might be starting with an entry level single family ownership opportunity or a larger rental opportunity, and you're sort of leaving a set of housing behind. In the middle of your life, your family may have grown, you may have expanded your housing needs. And then as your family starts to shrink again, as you get older, you start to downsize or maybe right size your housing consumption, going into a lower maintenance and smaller footprint situation. And then later in life, you might be in more of an independent or assisted living sort of situation. So what there is in sort of an ideal progression is housing variety that allows a family or an individual to consume the right amount of housing for their needs at that time. And unfortunately, what you see in rural communities is you see a huge amount of single family home typology, and you see probably very few rental homes and then typically very few kind of townhouse or low maintenance housing opportunities. And then I won't really get into senior housing, but that's probably its own crisis itself. And so what that forces is, a concept of a lack of affordable housing based on the fact that people are over or under consuming housing at any given moment. They're not really able to right size their housing consumption to their needs at that time. So here we're just really talking about market rate housing, but kind of talking about some failures in market rate housing that ends up making a housing market feel unaffordable, based on the fact that the right type of housing isn't available. There's just one observation I wanted to throw out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that we did that helps diversify that housing stock. So we can go to the next slide. The other observation is that usually there's not enough housing in communities, almost certainly not enough housing in rural communities. And the problem that we have here is just a fundamental problem of kind of what the market expectations are in the community and what new construction is able to cost. And by cost, I mean, the cost of construction that then gets translated into either a rental rate or a sales price. There's a pervasive and fundamental affordability gap. I would say it expands beyond rural communities, but it is especially within rural communities. I think of one particular community that we finished a project in recently that we'll talk about, the community of Milford. It's adjacent to Lincoln. A new construction 24-plex apartment building, we would need in a conventional financing sense, probably somewhere around $1,100 average rent in order to, repay our investors in that context, or create a market rate equity return, as well as pay for the debt service associated with that project. Now, the community of Milford really doesn't have many apartments renting for $1,100 a unit. And we're not really excited about having to rely on being the market leading rent charger when we go into a new community. And so what we're going to talk about is really, is part of this concept of innovation is, well, how do you get that pricing down, even in a conventional apartment situation, to more the levels that are acceptable, to where I think our average rent in that community is around $900 a unit between 1 and 2 bedrooms, which was much more in line with the community expectations and ability to pay. The same story exists for slightly different reasons on a starter home. Really, the cost of a new for sale home, even a very entry level, 12 to 1400 square foot slab on grade home, by the time you add sales and marketing costs and everything else, is upwards of 300,000, and that's as cheaply as you can do it with the input costs required. There are two issues there. There's a sort of an appraisal gap often in some of these communities where you aren't able to get a loan. There's in a smaller, more rural setting, you may not have enough sales data to support an appraisal of $300,000. And then you just simply have, affordability, which in the last year has really pushed, with the significant increase in interest rates, what would have at one time been a starter home that was affordable for folks making 80 to 120% median income. At this point, a lot of those, the mortgage that is required to be serviced at going from 3% to 8% is just so significantly higher that you've pushed a lot of the affordable home buyers out of the market as well. So this is really the need that we're having to think creatively about how we solve through both kind of this concept of innovation, but also I think in helping educate and understand at the community level why it is that an economic development team or a community staff would be focused on affordable housing, is because you just are not going to be able to add new housing into the community relying on open market conditions and meet the affordability expectations of the community. Or that's kind of the trend that we continue to see. We can go to the next slide. And the last thing that I just want to leave with before we get more into the case study is just how long housing projects typically take. Between sort of initially getting engaged, examining opportunities, and starting the process, you are often looking, at a 2 to 3 year progression before you have new housing placed in service. And so, different things can speed this up, different things can slow this down. Certainly in this example here, we're kind of looking at, there's a line here for housing applications. So if we're looking at any sort of program to help catalyze or lower the risk of the housing, you're often extending that time period. But even just the raw time period for a project of any sort of general scale, you're really talking about the work that you're doing today and a decision you might be making today being about meeting the housing needs of your community 3 years from now. So when you think of, well, gosh, we have a housing crisis or a housing problem that's translating really oftentimes into an economic development problem in my community. If you're not actively working on it now, there's really little chance it will get addressed in a meaningful way until a few years down the road. So I encourage everyone to just be mindful of that. We always internally talk about at our development firm how even when it feels like we have a really long time to do something, there's just always these initial actions that need to be done to keep a project on track. And projects usually stay stay on track and meet their timelines really based on what was done in the first 6 to 12 months. It's very rarely that a construction delay is what slows something down meaningfully. So those are just a few precedent observations. I really want to walk into the concept of innovation in the housing market, because I think what's especially challenging, and I think what you see there is that housing is very capital intensive and it's very time intensive, and so there's a lot of risk aversion just naturally in the housing market, where you're trying to do or trying to anticipate doing things based on what is a sort of a proven formula for success and what's been done before. But if we do that and we continue to do that, then we don't end up solving a lot of the nature of the housing affordability issues, which are some of those concepts around the diversity of housing and allowing people to consume the right level of housing for the right time of their life. And so I think what we have to do is try and think about what all of our roles are in facilitating housing innovation so that we're meeting that variety of needs. We're going to be talking today about repurposing old nursing homes, but a lot of this experimentation, I just wanted to give a couple of other examples that are very real from what we're facing right now. We have some questions. We're working on a project right now in a rural community, and it's a downtown renovation project that'll add a significant number of units in their downtown. And one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, well, we won't have any dedicated parking for this. In a rural community, you're very accustomed to having, parking right in front of your building. What will it mean, and will people rent if they can't park immediately underneath their own apartment or immediately in front of their house? It's a small question, but a meaningful one as far as, how do we understand the market and the evolving market in some of these places where you can't point to 3 or 4 different housing projects that have solved that problem in that market. We look a lot at housing typology and how do we get, for sale housing to be more affordable. Will people purchase a duplex with a single stall garage, or will they think of that as undesirable? Certainly that's meeting a lot of our price point objectives. But we may meet a price point objective, but still miss the market in a certain community. And then we're always asking ourselves, what's the right number of units to add into this community that we might be working in? We did a project in Valentine, Nebraska. We did 15 units of affordable housing. We probably could have done 30, but we just weren't sure in a community of 3,000 folks how much initially we felt comfortable sustaining. And we're always learning, but when there isn't a lot of new housing coming online, which there just simply isn't in many communities, all of these end up looking like experiments. And then again, just kind of coming back to thinking about this as experiments, then I think as communities, it helps to ask yourself and see yourself in the role of trying to remove some of the risk of these experiments. So what can you be doing, and what is your role in helping facilitate a developer to, better understand what is a risk in this community and what is not a risk? So I'll jump right into the meat of it. I'm doing a lot of talking, which I apologize for, but I'll try and get through the balance of this fairly quickly so that we can get to the Q&A. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is just one example of how we approached housing innovation. In 2019 and 2020, we were looking around and reading stories that probably many folks are familiar with, which is that nursing homes in many small towns were closing. And it wasn't clear that there was any opportunity to reuse these buildings for any productive use. We specifically identified units that were closing down in Crete, West Point, and Fremont. Those were the first 3 that we looked at. And so we had a couple of very initial questions. We really liked the idea of having affordable housing units in those markets. But we had some fundamental questions of just how would you execute the renovation of these units? And it started with, can we even purchase these at an affordable rate from their current seller? At the time, they were listed on the market for, I think, between $400,000 and $500,000 a building. We knew we weren't interested in paying that. We didn't know how willing the seller or not would be to negotiate. The next thing was just, could we renovate these in a cost-effective manner? They were all built in similar periods of time. They all had really the same structural components. They were very similar buildings, even if they have, they present a little bit differently. And then we didn't know how we would renovate them and whether we could create attractive units in them. And then even if we created them, we didn't know if people would rent them. And then lastly, we didn't really know if the communities would view this as a good opportunity or if they would prefer to do something else. So there were a number of questions that we had. And we can go ahead, but we knew that these were readily available. And we thought, well, if we could figure it out with one, and we could try and do it in a low risk way, maybe we could do it a few more times and utilize the knowledge that we learned and try and scale that innovation into multiple communities. So we go ahead and go to the next slide. So it turns out you can. And we set out to design and took an approach of really not reusing the interior layouts at all. We found them to be too constraining and that we couldn't get what we thought would be attractive units in the program. Instead, we took an approach where we would remove basically everything in the interior. We were reusing the floors, we were reusing the walls, and we were reusing the roofs, maybe with some modification. But we were really, you could drive a bulldozer through one of these buildings in the midst of a renovation. So really everything else on the interior of the layout would be brand new. What that really allowed us to do was create like totally modern apartments. We also took an approach where we didn't preserve the interior hallway, but we made these all open up to the outside. And what we really liked about that was it makes it feel like kind of an individual row home. It doesn't make it feel like an apartment necessarily. And it certainly gets away from any feeling that this was once a nursing home. Some of the other aspects that were more happenstance but turned out really nicely is that they're all single floor living. So it really serves a broad spectrum of renter, from a senior who's downsizing and wants a zero entry sort of opportunity to a family or an individual. The first project that we did, we utilized the Crane tax credit program in collaboration with NYFA. It's a program that at the year that we did it, they had expanded to include buildings where you were converting them from a non-residential use to a residential use. But the real advantage of it was that it's a very risk-averse program within the NYFA tax credit programs. The second nursing home that we did, we used the 9% competitive program. So we learned a lot in the first renovation. We were very confident about our cost structure and much more confident in that the units that we built would be appealing. And so we were more comfortable choosing a financing program that had some more risk associated with it. And in the third renovation that we did, we didn't use low-income tax credits at all. And instead, we used the Rural Workforce Housing Program and the Tax Increment Financing Program, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But the big advantage that we got in the execution of these other couple of programs is that we knew exactly what to expect from a cost perspective. And we found that we could convert these into really nice units at about 70% of new construction cost, which made us feel comfortable that we could meet the affordability needs of the community just in a straight up conventional manner with a limited amount of community support. We didn't have to rely on the tax credit program. So what you see in each of these is kind of a progression of our willingness and comfort as we learned more about the typology and got more comfortable with it, and also realized that, you know, the end result of the units that we put on the ground was extremely marketable. So we're just going to look at a couple of pictures since these are, you know, nice, visually nice at this point to look at, and give you some idea of what we're talking about. So if we can go to the next one. So this is Milford. We turned about a 15,000 square foot building into 21 apartments. The apartments are as nice as anything as you would see in an urban market rate development. We even have soft close cabinets on this one because we found a supplier where that was really a negligible increase in cost. And they have a variety of different layouts. And then what you can't see here is they enter into a common courtyard in the rear where we have a pergola and kind of lounge area for the residents. So the renovation turned out really nice. Each of these has its own exterior entrance. Some of the units even have extremely tall ceilings. We were able to get some additional height. And the project has leased up and stayed at about 100% occupancy since we brought it online last June. And it fits it's located in a really lovely area right adjacent to the elementary school, between the elementary school and downtown. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is Prospect Ridge. It's in the community of West Point, Nebraska. It really exhibits a lot of the same characteristics. In this case, we have some more space on the front of the lawn and put a pergola for the community residents' use. We have a community garden in the back. One of the areas that we pushed on here was we actually put a solar system. We had a lot of ground in West Point adjacent to the nursing home. And so we used that ground to put a ground-mounted solar system. So the residents are getting the benefit of the net metered solar. They have lower utility costs because we put that solar system in. It was just another example of trying to use a project and innovate in a certain area to help benefit the residents. Then we can go to the last one, the final one that we delivered, which turned out to be a little bit of a larger project. You know, one of the areas of our learning was these are especially attractive to us if they're kind of in the 15 to 25,000 square feet size. This one was 45,000 square feet. It's 49 units in Fremont, Nebraska. But still turned out really nice. They have a sort of a common courtyard where you can see we've got raised beds where the community garden will go. It's adjacent to the country club. You know, one of the other areas that we kind of learned as we were going through this process is because so many of these were built in the 60s, the rest of the communities have really built up around them. So they occupy, you know, usually a very visible and high profile area of the community or very nice area of the community that makes them, you know, particularly attractive for new affordable housing as well. So these are all kind of examples, and we've talked now to a number of different communities that have buildings like this or buildings very similar. And I think some of the obligation we always have too as developers is to try and share the success or share some of the learnings that we've had. You know, we've really dialed in at least this kind of approach on a cost per square foot basis. And so we're happy to be able to share that and help communities understand, you know, what would it look like to turn into housing? What would the community need to bring to as resources? And what could they ask of the developer? And we've seen other great examples of repurposing buildings like this. I think in some communities they become daycare centers. Some communities have torn them down but used the infrastructure and a variety of sort of different potential uses that require maybe less renovation. So I'm by no means saying this is the only thing that can be done with these buildings, but it's one typology that's worked out really well for us. I did want to talk just, more specifically about how these projects came together on the next page, if you don't mind, Sherry. So again, is just sort of what at the end, what did this end up looking like? We're talking about a situation where because we were, at a 20 to 25% discount of typical new construction cost, it's enabling us to rent at a significantly lower than what we would otherwise have to rent for. So this is in particular talking about the market rate version of this. We're at $795 for a studio, and like maybe $995 for one bedroom and around $1,200 for a two bedroom, which is 20 to 30% lower than we would have had to be with total new construction. We used both TIF and rural workforce housing. We'll talk a bit more about, thinking how those are tools in a moment, but the rural workforce housing really came in as a 10-year subordinate mortgage such that, we can get the project up and running. We can probably stabilize the financing, operate it for a period of time, and then refinance out the rural workforce housing so the community continued to have that as a source to invest. And then, we did use tax increment financing. One of the challenges with tax increment financing and reusing on an old building, specifically for a nursing home, is that the building was revalued from an existing operating value as a nursing home. It was revalued down and then revalued up again as a new apartment complex. And so we did have to walk the community back through that, and they did have to lose, for a 1 year period of time, the valuation of the building as a nursing home. But I think the discussion that we had is that, it really isn't a nursing home anymore. It's an abandoned building, needs to be valued as such. We can come in and repurpose it, but we'll need the benefit of those TIF dollars to help support that renovation. So what I have here below is, a general cost structure of what it looked like, and then just how that translated to a 25 unit project. As you can see here, we did not buy these, or we would not buy one of these nursing homes for $400,000 or $500,000. We ended up buying them for, basically just enough to make it worth the time of the real estate investment trust that was based out of New York to want to sell it to us, but significantly less than what they initially hoped they would get out of it. So I'll pause there, and I have some observations about what makes these successful or not successful. But are there any questions that I can answer at this point?
We do have a comment and a question in the chat box. Let me get back to one. You mentioned, exterior space. So do most of the apartments have two exterior doors? Leanne is asking that question. One to the front for parking and then one back out to the shared green space or courtyard. And
yeah. So it's kind of a range on the design. The ones that back up to a nice courtyard do have exterior entrances into those, and I think they're sliding doors, and so it wasn't too challenging to manage the space. But not every unit has two entrances. Some of them just enter to the front. Okay.
Well, then I think you answered her follow-up question. Was it a challenge in maximizing floor space if you had, two distinct egress points to the unit? So yeah, that and then Bradley had a thought to share. I was asking him if he would be willing to open his microphone. Bradley, are you with us, and would you mind just presenting your information?
Sure. Yeah, I came from a COG over in Southeast Iowa and did a bunch of upper story housing in, small towns from, 2,500 to 25,000, and they all have, pretty much the same issues. They've used to have a lot of buildings, and then cars came along, and so they tore those buildings down, and you got these big, surface parking lots on the edge of your downtown that are often, empty most of the time. So most of our downtown upper story housing units don't have elevators or walkout access to them. So the people that are living in those units are generally able-bodied people to begin with if they're walking upstairs. So what we found is that it's usually a way to avoid costs or concerns about parking is that we set aside some space for those upper story housing units in an off-street parking area. But then also we had to look at some of their ordinances because you'd be surprised how many are really outdated and don't allow parking after 11 o'clock p.m. or overnight. And when your street's empty, why the heck wouldn't you let people park there right in front of their unit if businesses aren't going to open up until 7-8 o'clock in the morning anyway? So thinking about some of those policy issues ahead of time is a really good way to potentially avoid tens of thousands of dollars in headaches for figuring out creating new parking or where they're going to go.
And I think that's a really great observation, and exactly how we've been thinking about it is, can we rent underutilized spaces in proximity, and will people be willing to walk that block? And I think you're exactly right. Is it really our expectation is that they will be, but it may be a little bit of a new thing in a particular community. So it's great to hear that you found that successful.
Jake, we do have another question. You've mentioned the use of TIF and rural workforce, but David wanted to know if you had utilized those in combination as well as LB 840 funds.
We've definitely combined TIF and rural workforce at this point. We haven't worked a ton with LB 840 directly. I think we bought some land that was probably prepared with LB 840. And I think we have a project coming up which will probably include some LB 840 funds. These community funds, what we really like about them is that they're really controlled at the community level. If a project is meeting your needs, we don't need to go out and convince or go through an application process that might take quite a bit of time for some state or federal level party. We can really work together to put that source, I guess, capitalization table together. So we've really enjoyed, specifically on the rural workforce housing, and we would think it was very similar on LB 840 and TIF too. So we're familiar with all of those, and they work together well. Yeah.
Great. No, we are going to say continue, Jake.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's go ahead and jump to talking about just what we've seen as sort of patterns of success, I suppose. There's some common challenges in renovating something. There's understanding the sort of zoning, fire, and building codes. And I think the last comment kind of hit on it too a little bit is there may be some legacy zoning that came in or that layers on top and that needs to be solved. And you may need some exemptions or just to negotiate together on what needs to be maintained out of that legacy zoning code. And like a parking requirement is a really good example. If you're doing upper story downtown housing and the community has a parking requirement of 2 units of parking per every housing unit, it's just not going to be possible if you can't work through some of those items and think about that code in the perspective of when it was created and what it's currently serving in the context of a project. So I think we're from a life safety perspective, it's not really our job as a developer to push those envelopes particularly, but I think from some of the other building code choices or zoning choices, certainly. I think the building condition and deterioration, if vacant, so much of a building condition is hidden from view. So much of a building project is getting worse over time. So thinking about how can you anticipate a building needing to be available and the opportunity to try and renovate it, and not put a huge amount of time between the last use and the new use. And I think of the community of Beatrice right now, I just call them out as being kind of forward thinking on this. They have some schools coming available, and they're working through a process now of trying to think through what that disposition looks like, and how do they become either, repurposed and newly productive, or is there an opportunity to remove them, but not letting a building sit vacant for a really, really long time and then hoping to convert it into a new use. One of the challenges that we had and have looked at on a few of these is just the fact that sometimes the owners are absentee, and securing their engagement can be very challenging. In the case of these nursing homes, they're really becoming available because large portfolios of nursing homes are trading hands, and then someone is deciding that they want to close down their Nebraska operations. Well, that requires being able to connect with potentially an investment firm out of New York and get their attention on a transaction that really is not core to their ongoing business. And so how do we do that as a developer? How can the community make sure that there's a good dialogue with the current owner? I think we saw some bad examples of that. I guess I'll call Beatrice out again with their Kensington hotel. There's some very good examples of that where they stayed in really close connection with the current owners and were able to facilitate the transfers of the building that they needed to do. Time and patience is critical. Depending on the funding mechanism, there can be a decent holding period going through funding cycles, and trying to think through everyone's appetite for who holds the project when. I think I saw a question about this, ensuring community buy-in. That's one of the first things as a developer that we're looking at is this community going to support affordable housing and support the renovation of this project? We had there's an old building that we were looking at that was co-located with a current school. And as we kind of just talked through the issues of adding apartments in that location, we decided, we're just not comfortable with it. And we're not comfortable with it because we don't think the community is going to be comfortable with it. And so making sure that the community sees that as kind of the highest and best use. And then I think in some cases, it's really managing the community's expectations too, as to, the need for rental housing, the opportunity for rental housing, that a lot of these are families, individuals that are really being underserved in their community right now. And these aren't, it's not something to be scared of, to have a rental housing project come into the community in some of these locations, but really is an opportunity. And just being realistic about the possibilities. There's certain assets that really we need to try and preserve, even if they cost more than building new. There's certain cases where that's certainly the case, and there's good reasons why we might make that investment. There's also the times where you have to say, gosh, that's not the best use of all of our time and resources, and let's take care of the building in a different way. Just going to the next slide, a couple of thoughts of the roadmap to success is just ensuring that the redevelopment into housing, that the community's bought in, that's the best use of the asset. It's pretty critical to make sure that that's the desired outcome, especially if you're working with an outside developer who's really relying on the community and what the community is telling us, to make pretty big investments in trying to drive a project forward. So securing that building, that consensus with local officials, the economic development team, understanding that, you may be preparing to offer TIF. You're going to need to kind of prepare a package. If you're wanting to capture the attention perhaps of an outside of the community developer. So making sure that they understand that's, often kind of table stakes, and not only from a financial resource perspective, but just from a perspective of where, as a developer, we can dedicate our time and attention. And the last thing we want to do is come into a community and try and put something in that community that half of the community is really against. There's enough communities where housing is of such need that we don't want to pick a local conflict and have that mar the project. We really want to come in where everyone's pretty aligned on the outcome. And then just thinking about what pre-work can be done to help catalyze the development. Do you have a relationship with the selling organization? Do you know who they are, and can they be can we readily get in touch with them? Do we have the plans for the building? Can those kind of things be assembled? Has any work been done on it, reasonably recently? Is there any assessment that could be done, locally or to help understand what the scope of the renovation would look like? And then understanding, what zoning codes or being prepared to understand, if it were converted to housing, here's exactly what that process would look like going through the city from an entitlement perspective and maybe a redevelopment agreement perspective. And then securing the right partnership for the goals. We were just in Hastings and seeing a lot of the work that's being done by Dave Rippey in the downtown. And a lot of those projects are really wonderful projects and probably are better executed at a local level, like what's happening there. And then there's certain projects where we're probably a better fit for that engagement. And it's trying to figure out, what sort of partner are you trying to attract as a community to help execute the goal. So I know I apologize. I spoke a lot, but we have some time remaining, so I'd like to open it up for questions. I think a couple of thoughts or anyone's comments is, what sort of housing projects have you seen in your community that have been successful that maybe didn't fit the mold or were different than what you had initially thought would be successful? And then, have you seen some housing efforts fail in your communities and why? It's one thought that might prompt some thoughts from everyone else. And then not sure if there's any other questions.
No, thanks for sharing some questions for our group. Does anybody have some feedback for Jake to his questions? This is a great opportunity to pick his brain and his experience. So, what's on your mind in terms of development in your community?
I'm curious if there's a if there's a scale that's too small. Two questions, I guess. Is there a scale that's too small? And then, so if you could only get 6 units or 3 units or whatever. And the other question would be buildings other than care home. Obviously, you had a lot of water and sewer. I presume when you gutted the interior, you still used a lot of that piping and all?
Well, we get to both of those. So for us right now, we have kind of 2 areas of developments. We kind of think of them as platforms and projects. So a platform might be, we've got platforms in Grand Island, Lexington, Fremont. And we're really, in those cases, we're looking at, kind of a minimum of maybe 80 to 100 units that we might do over a variety of different project types. So it might be a tax credit project, a rural workforce housing project, might be some for sale units. We could probably do a different session on how we're sort of layering some of these different things together into a platform. So those are larger, and in those cases, we can do 4 units of for sale housing because we already have the inventory. So we can kind of design a custom program with the community if we just want to test it out on a very small scale. We did this last year. We did 4 units in a couple of different communities that were close to communities where we were already working. That's turned out to be too small for us. So we're probably, in a brand new community, we'd probably be looking at sort of seeing a pathway to, at least 2 projects and maybe, at the end, kind of 30 to 40 units. But that's us, and others have different parameters. And then your other question, just on that quickly, and I see a question too on an old hospital building. I think this approach can scale to a lot of different types of buildings. And in the case of the nursing homes, we redid all the plumbing. We weren't able to conserve any of that because it was so deteriorated. But when we opened up the whole building, it let us lay it out where it would optimally be as well. Just looking at some of the thoughts that came through on the chat.
Yeah, Steve asked, is it safe to assume that the local community leadership was your willing and enthusiastic partner? And if not, that you parted ways?
Yeah, Steve, I think at this point, that's a lot of what we're trying to suss out in our initial engagement is, is the local housing leadership or the local leadership on board with this project? We're just not, there's so much need in so many communities. We just aren't really willing to get ourselves into a situation where there isn't alignment and there isn't enthusiastic partnership. And we look at these as really iterative relationships where we may be doing things over time. And so we don't want to force a project in any community because we really want to continue to work in the communities where we're spending time. The question about the city of Columbus looking at a housing subdivision, and that they're doing it to address the risk of a lot of the developers who are unwilling to take it on. So
I would
yeah,
be happy to, yeah.
what's being described there is laying out for a lot of different unit types, and then setting it up so that the developer doesn't need to pay for it until the unit is sold or a letter of occupancy is issued. So I think that is appealing, and I look forward to we'll be in Columbus next week. Look forward to learning a little bit more about it. We really are excited by that sort of work where different housing typologies are layered together, really helping ensure a return on that infrastructure investment, because different types of housing are easier to catalyze at different periods of time. In this market, just very immediately, for sale housing has been a little challenging. It's moved more slowly in a lot of rural communities. And so if you built a whole subdivision relying on selling all of those units, you might have a 2 to 3 year period where you're significantly slower than you'd like to be. And having the ability to sort of shift towards maybe a more rental typology or an apartment typology, lets you take the risk out of that entire development. So it's certainly how we look at developing in rural communities. And I appreciate that Columbus, you guys are looking at it similarly.
And it gave a response to that they've encountered some similar issues in Wakefield, or have done some similar things in Wakefield as what Gene is talking about in Columbus, but have had builders that didn't meet deadlines and such. So it's been an issue in Wakefield as well. So did you want to talk a little bit more about the hospital building or
Well, I'll just make a quick comment on the Wakefield comment. So one of the things that we think a lot about is like who bears the risk and when in a project. And one of the things we think about is when we start construction, we're really making a commitment over the construction period to do exactly what we say we're going to do. And we don't always know in a smaller community what the market is going to do. And so a lot of that we structure into how we use community funds. And I think you could kind of do that somewhat similarly in sort of the land program, where you really put the builder on the hook for doing the piece that the builder understands best, which is, they should be able to deliver you a building if they say they're going to. And if for some reason that building doesn't absorb as quickly as they'd like, maybe the community helps remove the risk of that. But that's all probably a longer conversation. I'd be happy to follow up. I do think this can work for an old hospital building. One of the big advantages that we had in our work is that these buildings were all so very, very similar. So our work in West Point directly translated to our work in Milford. One of the challenges that I've seen in some of the old hospitals is they're just very differently designed. So presents some different challenges. And I know the Messners have done a big hospital project, I think in Columbus, that they have some, quite a few lessons learned on. But the general concept I think can still apply. And then just on issues on staffing retention, yes, we really operate and as a general contractor. So I think we see this more with our subcontractors and subcontractor turnover, but we do have a lot of issues in getting the right subcontractors onto the right projects, and are often finding that, having folks drive out, when we did the project in Grand Island, or sorry, in Valentine, we had a lot of our sub base drove out from Lexington and Grand Island because we just couldn't find local contractors who were at the scale even for just a 15-unit project. So certainly seeing some of those staffing issues more from, our subcontractors.
Okay, great conversation. Thank you. Are there any other questions coming to the surface for Jake as we begin to approach the 3 o'clock hour? What's on your mind? Well, I'm not hearing or seeing anything additional in the chat box, Jake. So thank you so much. We put your contact information on the screen. So if people want to reach out to you, they can certainly do so through your email and through the office address there on the screen. So greatly appreciated. So as we begin to conclude with Jake, I do want to remind you that past webinars are available on our HomeNE.us website. In 2023, if you were with us, we featured Blue Springs, Nebraska with the One Property at a Time organization. And I happened to see some of these updated numbers from them on a Facebook page recently. So I just wanted to share that with you. But most excited about that last bullet point. They have increased their valuation from just over $300,000 of dilapidated structures to a new valuation of $1 million by mid-July of this year. So excited to see what's going on, and people are taking notice. Senator Ricketts had some staff out in Blue Springs recently. So that was pretty exciting to see one of our past speakers in their community getting some notoriety and the attention of some of our congressional delegation. So and then also to just let you know that next month's speaker will be Beverly Hansen. If you don't know Beverly, you're missing out. She is I would say, a community volunteer extraordinaire. Not only does she serve on the Nebraska Community Foundation Board of Directors, but she is a vital and just a movement of volunteerism in Bertrand and Phelps County. She will be joining us on February 15th to talk about what all is going on in Bertrand and the new organization over there, the Bertrand Community Builders. She will be joined in the conversation by SCED staff, just to kind of give you a backstory as well as all the progress that is being made over there. So, Jake, once again, thank you so very much. I greatly appreciate the time that you took out of your busy schedule to present today. It was wonderful, and I know we all learned a lot. So do you have any final thoughts you want to share with us?
Yeah, Lori, thanks. And thank you for the time. And I did have a few final thoughts. I did want to say, so much of our work is made possible in collaboration with NIFA, in collaboration with DED, and in collaboration with communities that want to see great work happen. And so, we all just need to make sure to recognize all the work that's being done at the state level to help this work at a local level happen, and then the local level. And then lastly, we're always as a state always defending and make sure we need to trumpet the successes that we're having. We're going into a legislative session right now where there will be some more resources to help support housing in rural communities. And so I'd implore everyone to think about what they can do to help their senators and the political folks understand, both the need for housing and then the successes that we've had translating their programs into actual units on the ground. And I think if everyone kind of understands these stories, we'll be able to continue to get the resources needed to continue our work in some of these more challenging situations. So really appreciate, Lori, you and the team bringing this, keeping this within the focal point and on everyone's agenda. And feel free to reach out to us. And if we can help or steer you in the right direction, we'd be happy to.
Super. Thanks for those concluding words. Words well spoken as the new legislative session does begin or has begun, and work is out there to be done. So thank you to all of you. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us on our January edition of HomeNE.